Hello and welcome back to our channel. On screen, Peter Sellers was the harmless fool who charmed the world. But behind closed doors, he was a predator fueled by a malignant self-hatred. He looked at Britt Ekland, the stunning Bond girl, and saw a light that blinded him, so he decided to extinguish it. Driven by a pathological envy, he didn't just criticize her, he vandalized her reality. He shrouded a sex symbol in the gray rags of a matron and dug his fingers into her flesh, pinching perfection until she saw deformity. He wasn't trying to love her. He was hollowing her out, turning a diamond into dust just to ensure she would never be strong enough to walk away. Peter was raised by a mother who worshipped him, creating a man who was both narcissistic and deeply insecure. By 1964, Peter was looking for a new partner. Enter Britt Ekland, 21 years old, fresh from Sweden with a suitcase of dreams and a face that stopped traffic. She was the Nordic goddess archetype, blonde, blue-eyed, and physically perfect. But inside that perfect shell, Britt was not the confident siren the magazines portrayed. She was a girl who had grown up chubby. She was a girl who had been teased for her weight in Stockholm. She carried the fat girl trauma in her mind, even though her body was now slender. She was naive. She was trusting. She was looking for safety in a big, scary city. She was the perfect victim for a predator who specialized in sniffing out insecurity. Peter saw her photograph in a newspaper in his suite at the Dorchester Hotel. He was sitting with his valet, Bert. He pointed a manicured finger at the grainy black and white image of Britt. "I am going to marry that girl," he said. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her personality. He didn't know if she spoke English. It didn't matter. He wasn't looking for a conversation. He was looking for an acquisition. He saw her the way a collector sees a rare diamond in a catalog. He decided he had to own her. The courtship was not a seduction. It was a military siege. Peter tracked her down to her hotel, but he didn't ask her out for a drink. He deployed his wealth like a weapon. He sent flowers to her room, not a bouquet, not a vase. He sent an entire garden. Hundreds of pounds worth of lilies, roses, and orchids flooded her small suite until there was literally no room to walk. The air was thick with the scent of flowers, suffocating and sweet. Britt was dazzled. She was a 21-year-old girl from a modest background, and suddenly the most famous comedian in the world was treating her like royalty. She didn't see the red flags. She didn't see the obsession. She saw a fairy tale. When they finally met, Peter was electric. He turned on the charm. He used his 1,000 voices to entertain her. He was funny, attentive, and seemingly vulnerable. He told her she was the most beautiful creature he had ever seen. He told her he had been waiting for her his entire life. He mirrored her. He found out what she liked, and suddenly he liked it too. He became exactly what she wanted him to be. Peter wasn't falling in love. He was casting a role. He played the perfect boyfriend, and Britt was the sole audience member in the front row. They married 10 days later. 10 days. It was a whirlwind. It was madness. The press went wild. The beauty and the beast, they whispered, the genius and the sex symbol. The photos from the wedding show a beaming Britt, looking at Peter with adoration. Beside her, Peter looks triumphant. He looks like a man gripping a trophy, daring anyone to try and take it away. The honeymoon is usually where the marriage begins. For Peter and Britt, it was where the nightmare started. As soon as the ring was on her finger, the perfect boyfriend character was retired. Peter didn't need to perform anymore. He had the contract signed. The flowers stopped coming. The compliments dried up. The mask fell off, and the real Peter Sellers, the moody, insecure, controlling tyrant, stepped into the light. It started with the clothes. They were in Hollywood, preparing for a glamorous life. Britt was excited. She was young, she was beautiful, and she wanted to dress like it. She loved the fashion of the 60s, the miniskirts, the bold prints, the makeup that emphasized her eyes. She was a mod icon in the making. Peter hated it. He felt panic. He realized that when they walked into a room together, everyone looked at Britt, not him. He decided to change her appearance to match his own insecurities. He began to criticize her wardrobe, but he didn't say, "I'm jealous." He said, "You look cheap." "That skirt is too short, Britt," he would say, his voice dripping with disdain. "You look like a tart. Is that what you want people to think? That you're a common streetwalker? You're wearing too much makeup. You look like a clown. Take it off. A wife of Peter Sellers does not go out looking like that." He began to purge her closet. He threw away the miniskirts. He threw away the fitted dresses. In their place, he bought her a new wardrobe. He chose the clothes himself. He bought her heavy tweeds. He bought her skirts that fell below the knee. He bought her high-necked blouses in drab colors, grays, browns, and dull greens. He bought her sensible flat shoes that killed her posture. He dressed the most sexually desirable woman of the decade like a 50-year-old librarian. Britt was confused. She looked in the mirror and saw a frumpy stranger. But Peter insisted. "This is class, Britt," he told her. "This is how a lady dresses. You don't know anything about style. I'm teaching you." He was using his authority as the older, wiser genius to dismantle her perception of reality. She began to doubt herself. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was tacky. Maybe she did look cheap. She wanted to be a good wife. She wanted to make him proud. So she put on the brown skirt. She scrubbed her face clean. She tied her hair back. She walked out of the hotel room looking like his mother. And Peter smiled. For the first time, he felt safe. If she looked frumpy, no one would stare at her. If no one stared at her, she wouldn't be tempted to leave him. And most importantly, if she looked plain, he would finally be the most interesting person in the room again. But the clothes were just the outer layer. Peter needed to destroy her confidence from the inside out. He needed to make her believe that her physical perfection was actually a deformity. This is where the pinch began. Britt Ekland had a body that was mathematically perfect. Her waist was tiny. Her legs were toned. She was a dancer. There was not an ounce of excess fat on her frame. Peter knew this, but he also knew that Britt had been a chubby child. He knew that was her weak spot. He knew she lived in fear of gaining weight. One evening, while Britt was dressing for dinner, Peter walked into the bathroom. He stood behind her as she looked in the mirror. He stared at her reflection with a look of critical concern. He reached out with his thumb and forefinger. He found a tiny fold of skin on her waist, the kind of skin that exists on every human body when it moves. He pinched it. Hard. "Britt," he whispered, shaking his head, "look at this. Rubbish." Britt looked. She saw skin. "You're getting chunky, darling," Peter said. "You're letting yourself go. I can feel the fat. It's disgusting." He moved his hand to her arm. He pinched again. "And here, more rubbish. You're getting soft." It was a lie. It was a hallucination. But it was delivered with such conviction that Britt panicked. She looked at herself in the mirror, and the image warped. She didn't see the Bond girl. She saw the fat girl from Sweden. She saw the rubbish that Peter saw. This became a nightly ritual. The pinch. Peter would inspect her like a livestock judge. He would poke, prod, and pinch, pointing out imaginary flaws. He convinced her that she was on the verge of obesity. Britt began to starve herself. She stopped eating lunch. She survived on black coffee and cigarettes. She exercised frantically. She shrank. But no matter how thin she got, Peter would always find a pinch of skin. Still fat, he would say, still rubbish. He was projecting his own body dysmorphia onto her. Peter hated his own body. He felt fat and sluggish. He couldn't fix himself, so he transferred that self-hatred to Britt. He needed her to be flawed so that he wouldn't feel so alone in his imperfection. By the end of their first month of marriage, Britt Ekland was a shell. She was dressed in tweed, starving, and convinced she was hideous. Peter Sellers had successfully stolen her face. He had replaced her reality with his own, and this was just the beginning. The war for her soul had only just started. The psychological siege of Britt Ekland did not stop at the wardrobe door. Once Peter Sellers had colonized her body, dictating the fabric that touched her skin and the food that entered her mouth, he turned his attention to the one thing that offered her an escape hatch: her career. To a man like Peter, whose entire existence was predicated on being the only star in the galaxy, a wife with a job was not a partner. She was a competitor. And Peter Sellers did not tolerate competition. In 1964, Britt was cast in a film titled Guns at Batasi. It was a significant role for a young actress, a chance to prove she was more than just a Swedish mannequin. She was playing opposite Richard Attenborough. It should have been a moment of celebration. In a normal marriage, the husband would have sent champagne to the dressing room. He would have helped her run lines. He would have stood in the wings, beaming with pride. Peter Sellers did none of these things. He viewed the production of the film as an act of infidelity. In his warped logic, every moment Britt spent on set was a moment she was not spending worshiping him. Every line of dialogue she memorized was brain space that should have been occupied by his needs. He decided that if he could not forbid her from working, which would look bad to the press, he would make the experience so excruciating that she would quit of her own accord. He began to stalk the production. He would arrive on set unannounced, driving his expensive cars right up to the soundstage. He wasn't there to visit. He was there to inspect. He would stand behind the director, arms crossed, his face a mask of critical disdain, watching Britt try to perform. Imagine the pressure. You are 21. English is your second language. You are acting alongside legends, and your husband, the comedy genius, the man the world calls a master of the craft, is standing 10 feet away, rolling his eyes every time you open your mouth. He would cut the tension with loud derogatory sighs. He would whisper to the crew, loud enough for Britt to hear, "She's stiff, isn't she? Wooden. Look at her hands. She doesn't know what to do with her hands." He was directing a play within a play, casting Britt as the failure. He made her so nervous that she began to fluff her lines. She began to shake. Her confidence, already fragile from the nightly pinching sessions at home, evaporated under the glare of his judgment. The crew began to whisper. They saw a young actress struggling, unaware that she was being psychologically dismantled in real time. Peter was creating the very incompetence he mocked. When psychological warfare on set failed to break her contract, Peter escalated to physiological blackmail. He realized that the only thing that could pull Britt away from the camera was the threat of his own death. He was a hypochondriac of the highest order, a man who monitored his own pulse like a stockbroker watching the ticker tape. He began to weaponize his health. If Britt had a crucial scene to film, the phone in the production office would ring. It would be Peter. He would be gasping. He would claim he was having chest pains. He would claim his arm was numb. "Britt," he would wheeze, "it's the big one. I'm dying. You have to come home." Britt young and terrified, would drop everything. She would leave the set, infuriating the director and the producers, and rush back to their penthouse. She would drive with tears streaming down her face, praying she wasn't too late. She would burst through the front door expecting to find paramedics, oxygen tanks, a body on the floor. Instead, she would find Peter sitting up in bed, perfectly healthy, watching cartoons or playing with a new camera lens. He would look at her, his face flushing with the warmth of satisfaction, and say, "I feel much better now that you're here. You're my medicine, Britt. I just needed you." It was a calculated manipulation. He learned that her fear was a leash, and he tugged it whenever she strayed too far into independence. He trained her to prioritize his imaginary illnesses over her real career. He made her unprofessional. He made her unreliable. He was systematically destroying her reputation in the industry so that no one would hire her, ensuring she would remain trapped in his domestic jar forever. On April 5, 1964, Peter suffered a massive heart attack. It was likely caused by a combination of stress and allegedly the use of amyl nitrites. This was not a mild angina. It was a catastrophic cardiovascular event. His heart stopped beating. He was clinically dead. The blood stopped flowing to the brain of the world's funniest man. Britt was there. She was the one who called for help. She was the one who watched the man who had tormented her turn blue on the floor. In that moment, all the abuse, all the fat-shaming, all the jealousy evaporated. She was just a wife trying to save her husband. At the hospital, the doctors worked on him with the desperation reserved for national treasures. His heart stopped 8 times. Doctors shocked him back to life repeatedly. It was a medical miracle that he survived. For days he lay in a coma, hovering between this world and the next. Britt Ekland did not leave the hospital. She slept on the floor of the corridor. She stopped eating. She prayed to a God she wasn't sure Peter believed in. The press camped outside, hungry for the obituary of Inspector Clouseau. Inside, a 21-year-old girl was bargaining with fate, offering her own happiness in exchange for the life of the man who made her miserable. When Peter Sellers finally woke up, the world expected a transformation. The narrative of the near-death experience is a popular trope. We expect the survivor to wake up grateful. We expect them to see the light, to realize that love is the only thing that matters, to apologize for their sins. Peter survived, but the experience did not humble him. Instead, he became more paranoid and resentful. The oxygen deprivation seemed to strip away his social inhibitors. The filter was gone. The paranoia, which had always been a hum in the background, was now a siren. And worst of all, he looked at Britt, the woman who had slept on the floor, the woman who had saved him, and he didn't feel gratitude. He felt resentment. He hated that she had seen him weak. He hated that she had seen him with tubes down his throat, helpless, stripped of his dignity. He felt humiliated. By witnessing his mortality, Britt had gained a power over him that he couldn't abide. He felt exposed, and to regain his sense of superiority, he had to punish the witness. The abuse didn't stop, it mutated. It became colder, more precise. He began to treat her not just as a possession, but as an enemy who knew his secrets. As he recovered, the dynamic in the house shifted from tyranny to absolute dictatorship. Peter used his survival as a shield. He was now the miracle man. He was fragile. He couldn't be upset. If Britt argued with him, he would clutch his chest. "Careful, Britt," he would whisper. "Do you want to kill me? Do you want to finish the job?" He held his own life hostage in every argument. He made her terrified to speak, to move, to breathe, lest she trigger the fatal arrhythmia that would make her a widow and a murderer in the eyes of the public. It was in this atmosphere of walking on eggshells that the ultimate betrayal of Peter's aesthetic occurred. Nature intervened. Britt Ekland got pregnant. For most couples, a baby is a blessing. For Peter Sellers, it was a vandalism of his property. He looked at Britt's stomach, which had been flat and perfect, the stomach he had pinched and critiqued, and saw it expanding. He didn't see the miracle of life. He saw a deformity. His reaction was visceral and repulsive. He stopped touching her. He moved into a separate bedroom, claiming he needed his rest. But the truth was he couldn't stand the sight of her changing body. He became a vocal critic of the biological process. He would walk into the room where she was resting, her ankles swollen, her face glowing with the flush of pregnancy, and he would grimace. "You look enormous," he would say, not with wonder, but with disgust. "You look like a house, a cow. How are you ever going to get your figure back? You've ruined yourself, Britt. You've absolutely ruined the goods." He made her feel that the baby was a parasite that was eating her beauty. He made her apologize for the shape of her own womb. He stripped the joy from the experience completely. Britt stopped looking in mirrors, not because she was afraid of what she would see, but because she was afraid she would see it through Peter's eyes. She began to hide her bump under loose clothes, not for comfort, but shame. The tension reached a boiling point in Rome. Peter was filming After the Fox. He demanded Britt accompany him. He needed his entourage. He needed his audience. But he forgot that the audience in Italy didn't care about a balding, middle-aged Englishman. They cared about the Nordic goddess. When they stepped off the plane at Fiumicino Airport, the paparazzi were waiting. It was a swarm. The flashbulbs popped like gunfire, but the lenses weren't pointed at Peter. They were pointed at Britt, even pregnant. Perhaps because she was pregnant, she was radiant. She was the story. "Bella Britt! Bella!" they shouted. They crowded around her, thrusting flowers at her, ignoring the man standing next to her. Peter Sellers stood on the tarmac, and for a few seconds he ceased to exist. He was an extra. He was the husband of the star. Peter was furious. He physically grabbed her arm, shoved her through the crowd, and threw her into the car. He slammed the door in a rage. Britt rubbed her bruised arm, tears welling in her eyes. Peter didn't ask if she was okay. He turned on her, his face purple, his eyes bulging behind his thick glasses. "You love it, don't you?" he hissed. Spittle flew from his mouth. "You love making me look like a fool. You think you're the star? You think they care about you? You're nothing without me. You're just a pregnant Swede I picked up in a hotel. I made you, and don't you forget it." He spent the rest of the trip punishing her for the crime of being popular. He locked her in the hotel room. He forbade her from speaking to the press. He went out to dinners alone, leaving his pregnant wife to order room service. Isolated in a golden cage, listening to the sounds of Rome through a window she wasn't allowed to open. In January 1965, the inevitable happened. Victoria Sellers was born. The arrival of a daughter should have softened him. It famously softens even the hardest men. But Peter was not a hard man. He was a broken man. He looked into the crib at the infant Victoria and felt nothing. No surge of oxytocin. No protective instinct. He felt a deep, chilling annoyance. The baby cried. To Peter, this wasn't a cry for help. It was a heckler. It was a noise that interrupted his script reading. It was a noise that stole the attention of the nanny, the housekeeper, and most importantly, his wife. He viewed his daughter not as a legacy, but as a rival. He refused to hold her. He refused to use her name. He referred to Victoria as it or the thing. "Can you shut that thing up?" he would scream from his study. "I am trying to work. I am a genius trying to create art, and I am surrounded by screaming banshees." He treated the baby like a defective prop that had been delivered to the wrong set. He wanted to send it back. And then he turned his eyes back to Britt. The baby was out. The stomach was deflating. But the damage, in Peter's eyes, was done. He didn't give her time to recover. He didn't give her time to heal from the birth. He restarted the aesthetic war immediately. "You've still got the weight, Britt," he said days after she gave birth. He resumed the pinch. He would grab the soft postpartum skin of her stomach and shake his head. "Rubbish. Absolute rubbish. You've let yourself go completely. Who's going to want to look at you now?" Britt was exhausted. She was sleep-deprived, hormonal, and trying to care for a newborn that her husband despised. And now she was being told she was repulsive. The trap was complete. She was a mother, which made it harder to leave. She was ugly, which made her believe she couldn't leave. And she was married to a man who could fake a heart attack to stop her from walking out the door. She began to diet with a manic intensity. She exercised until she fainted. She starved herself to shrink back into the mannequin dimensions that Peter demanded. She wasn't doing it for health. She was doing it for survival. She believed that if she could just get thin enough, if she could just get perfect enough, Peter would love her again. She believed that the perfect boyfriend from the Dorchester Hotel was still in there, buried under the fat she needed to lose. She didn't realize that the perfect boyfriend never existed. She was chasing a ghost, and the man she was living with was getting worse. The paranoia was deepening, the control was tightening, and soon the abuse would move from the private sphere of the bedroom to the public sphere of the movie set in a display of professional sabotage that would become legendary in Hollywood for its cruelty. This cruelty could not be contained within the four walls of their home. A tyrant like Peter Sellers requires a larger audience for his punishments. He needed the world to witness Britt's dismantling, to prove that without his genius, she was nothing more than a prop. So he dragged their private nightmare out into the unforgiving lights of the movie set, turning her career into the next casualty. In 1967, during the filming of The Bobo, Peter's need for control escalated to her professional life. By 1966, the dynamic of the marriage had calcified into a rigid cycle of control and punishment, but Britt still possessed one dangerous asset: her career. She was under contract to 20th Century Fox. She was a rising star. The world wanted to see her. To Peter, this was unacceptable. Every script sent to the house was treated like a declaration of war. He would read them before she did, scanning the pages, not for the quality of the dialogue, but for the proximity of other men. If a scene required a kiss, he went into a sulk that lasted for days. If a scene required her to be attractive, he critiqued it as smut. He was terrified that if Britt achieved genuine success on her own merits, she would realize that she didn't need the validation of a neurotic comedian to survive. He had to keep her dependent. He couldn't simply forbid her from acting. That would damage his public image as the benevolent, supportive husband. He had to be subtler. He had to bring her into his orbit, where he could control the lighting, the camera angles, and the criticism. He hatched a plan to cast her in his next major project, The Bobo. On paper, it looked like a romantic gesture. The biggest star in the world leveraging his power to get his wife a leading role. In reality, it was a trap. By casting Britt as his co-star, Peter ensured that she was under his surveillance 24 hours a day. There would be no escape, no private lunches with castmates, no moments of freedom in the makeup chair. He would be there, watching, judging, and directing every breath she took. The production of The Bobo in Rome became legendary in Hollywood circles, not for the film itself, which was a mediocre comedy, but for the absolute psychological disintegration of its star. Rome, the city where Peter had previously shoved a pregnant Britt into a limousine, became the backdrop for the final act of their marriage. Peter arrived on set not as an actor, but as a dictator. He was suffering from the delusion that he was the only competent person in the industry. He clashed immediately with the director Robert Parrish. Peter didn't want to be directed. He wanted to be obeyed, and he used Britt as the proxy for his frustration. When the cameras rolled, the abuse began. It was a masterclass in public humiliation. Peter would stop a scene midway through a take. He would hold up his hand, silence the crew, and turn to Britt. "No," he would say, his voice flat and cold. "You're doing it wrong. You're not funny. You're just standing there like a piece of furniture. Try to act, darling, if you can manage it." He would mimic her accent. He would roll his eyes at the lighting cameraman, as if to say, "Can you believe I have to work with this amateur?" Britt stood there frozen under the hot lights, surrounded by 100 crew members who were too terrified of Peter to intervene. She would try again. She would try to be funnier, lighter, sexier. But the harder she tried, the more Peter attacked. He was grinding her confidence into dust. He wanted her to fail. He wanted the crew to see her fail so that everyone would agree with his internal narrative. Britt is nothing without Peter. The toxicity on set became suffocating. The crew walked on eggshells. They stopped making eye contact with Britt, not because they disliked her, but because they knew that showing her any kindness would paint a target on their backs. Peter was jealous of anyone who offered her a lifeline. If a makeup artist laughed at Britt's joke, Peter would have that artist fired or reassigned. He isolated her completely, but professional humiliation wasn't enough. Peter needed absolute control over the production itself. He decided he wanted Robert Parrish fired. He wanted to direct the film himself. The studio refused. They knew Peter was unstable. They needed a professional at the helm. So Peter Sellers pulled the ace from his sleeve. He decided to play the health card. He knew that his heart attack in 1964 was the defining trauma of Britt's life. He knew she lived in constant terror of him dying. He knew that the studio insurers were terrified of losing their investment. He weaponized his medical history with the cold calculation of a sociopath. One afternoon, in the middle of a dispute with Parrish, Peter collapsed. He clutched his chest. He gasped, his face contorted in agony. "It's happening again," he wheezed. "My heart." Panic swept the set. The memory of his near-death experience was fresh in everyone's mind. The medic was called. An ambulance was summoned. And Britt Ekland, the woman he had been tormenting for weeks, reverted instantly to the terrified nurse. She rushed to his side. She held his hand. She cried, begging him to breathe, begging him not to leave her. For Britt, this was real. The trauma of seeing him blue and lifeless on the floor in 1964 came rushing back. She was trembling. She was ready to sacrifice the movie, her career, everything, just to keep him alive. Peter was loaded into the ambulance. Britt rode with him, clutching his hand, whispering prayers. When they arrived at the hospital, the doctors swarmed. They hooked him up to the ECG machines. They ran the blood tests. They prepared the defibrillators. And they found nothing. His heart rhythm was perfect. His blood pressure was normal. There was no enzyme spike indicating an infarction. Peter Sellers was as healthy as a horse. He was lying in the hospital bed, eating a sandwich, watching the chaos he had created with a look of supreme satisfaction. He had faked it. He simulated a heart attack solely to manipulate the studio into firing the director. It was a calculated move. He forced the studio to choose between his health and the director's job. Using Britt's trauma as a lever. The studio eventually capitulated to some demands, but the damage to the marriage was irreparable. Britt sat in that hospital room watching him chew his sandwich, and a cold realization began to settle in her stomach. She realized that his health was a weapon. She realized that he would do anything, absolutely anything, to win. But the chaos of the Bobo was not just internal. It was fueled by external forces, specifically Peter's reliance on the occult. By 1967, Peter Sellers had largely abandoned logic. He had replaced it with the advice of Maurice Woodruff, a famous clairvoyant and astrologer. Peter would not make a decision without consulting Woodruff. If the stars said, "Don't travel," Peter wouldn't travel. If the stars said blue is a bad color, Peter would throw away his blue shirts. This sounds like an eccentricity, a quirky trait of a creative genius. In practice, it was a nightmare for everyone around him. Woodruff became the third person in the marriage. Peter would call him at all hours, and often Peter used Woodruff to validate his own paranoia. He would call the astrologer and ask, "Is Britt being faithful?" Woodruff, knowing who paid his bills, would often feed Peter's insecurities with vague warnings. "Be careful of a man with dark hair," he might say, or "someone close to you is envious." Peter would take these vague Barnum statements and turn them into concrete accusations. He would hang up the phone and storm into the bedroom. "Who is he, Britt? Maurice sees a dark-haired man. Is it the waiter? Is it your co-star? Tell me." Britt would stare at him exhausted. "There is no one, Peter. I am here with you. I am always with you." "Don't lie to me," Peter would scream. "The stars don't lie. You're plotting against me." He began to dictate their life based on these superstitions. He banned the color purple from the house because he was told it was the color of death. If Britt bought a dress that had a shade of violet in it, Peter would have a meltdown. He would act as if she had brought a loaded gun into the nursery. He would take scissors to the garment, shredding it, screaming that she was trying to curse him. He refused to sign contracts on certain days. He refused to fly on certain airlines. Britt lived in a minefield where the locations of the mines changed every day based on the morning horoscope. It was exhausting. It was madness. And then came the jealousy. It wasn't just sexual jealousy. It was professional envy. Peter Sellers could not stand to see Britt acting opposite anyone he considered a threat. When she worked with Yul Brynner in The Ultimate Warrior, later on, but the dynamic started earlier, or any charismatic leading man, Peter spiraled. He didn't accuse her of sleeping with them. That would be too simple. He accused her of admiring them. "I saw how you looked at him in that scene," Peter would say. "I was acting, Peter. The script says I'm in love with him." "No, that wasn't acting," Peter would counter, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I know acting. That was real. You think he's better than me, don't you? You think he's taller, stronger. You think he's a real man, and I'm just a clown." He was projecting his deepest insecurity, that he was not a leading man, but a character actor who had tricked the world. He believed that Britt, with her perfect beauty, naturally belonged with a real hero, not a comedic imposter. He punished her for his own imposter syndrome. He would wake her up in the middle of the night to interrogate her. "Do you think I'm talented, Britt?" he would ask at 3 a.m. "Yes, Peter, you're a genius. You're just saying that. You don't mean it. You look at me and you see a fat, bald Jew. I know you do." He would keep her awake until dawn, forcing her to validate him, forcing her to list the reasons she loved him. By the time the sun came up, Britt was a zombie. She would go to set with dark circles under her eyes, her hands trembling. And Peter would look at her haggard appearance and say, "You look terrible today. You're aging, Britt. It's sad to watch." He was sleep-depriving her to break her will, then mocking the physical toll it took. By the spring of 1967, Britt Ekland was 24 years old, but her spirit was ancient. She had survived the clothes shaming, the pinching, the fake heart attacks, the astrological tyranny, and the public humiliation. She was running on fumes. The breaking point didn't come with a grand explosion. It came with a moment of quiet clarity. They were back in the hotel suite in Rome. The air was thick with the smoke of Peter's cigarettes and the tension of another argument. Peter was ranting. He was throwing objects, a script, an ashtray, a glass. He was screaming that she was ungrateful. He was screaming that he was the only reason she existed. Britt looked at him, really looked at him. She didn't see the genius anymore. She didn't see the provider. She saw a small, frightened tyrant in his underwear, his face red, his eyes dead behind the thick glasses. She saw the ugliness he had been trying to project onto her. She realized with a sudden jolt that the rubbish wasn't on her waist. It was standing in front of her. She realized that he would never change. The perfect boyfriend was not coming back. The man who bought the flowers at the Dorchester was a character, and Peter had forgotten the lines. This reality, the screaming, the controlling, the madness, was the only reality there was. She stood up. She was trembling, but her voice was steady. "I'm leaving, Peter." Peter stopped mid-sentence. He blinked. He let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "Leaving? You? Don't be stupid. Where would you go? Who would want you? You're a fat, talentless girl I rescued. Without me, you're nothing." "I'd rather be nothing than be this," she said. She walked to the bedroom. She didn't pack a trunk. She didn't pack the furs or the jewels. She grabbed a small bag. She grabbed her passport. Peter realized she wasn't bluffing. The panic set in. The abandonment issues that had driven his entire life flared up like a nuclear detonation. He didn't apologize. He attacked. "You can't leave me," he screamed, running after her. "You belong to me. I bought you. I made you." He chased her into the hallway of the hotel. It was a pathetic, grotesque scene. The great Peter Sellers, half naked, chasing his young wife down the corridor, screaming threats and pleas. Doors opened. Guests stared. The illusion of the golden couple was shattered on the carpet of the hotel hallway. Britt didn't look back. She kept walking. She walked out of the hotel, into a taxi, and into the unknown. But walking away was the easy part. Escaping Peter Sellers was impossible. He was not a man who accepted resignation. If he couldn't own her, he would destroy her. The divorce would not be a legal procedure. It would be a public execution of her character. He would use the press, his lawyers, and his fame to burn her to the ground. As the taxi pulled away, Britt Ekland was free for the first time in 3 years. But she carried the scars. She carried the voice in her head that said she was fat. She carried the fear of the pinch. And she carried the knowledge that the man she had loved was capable of a darkness that the audience of the Pink Panther would never believe. The clown was crying, but this time it wasn't sorrow. It was pure, corrosive rage. This rage crystallized into a weapon. Peter Sellers was not a man to accept a resignation letter from a possession. If she wouldn't be his wife, she would be his target. As the distance between them grew, Peter turned his artillery toward London, preparing a scorched earth campaign that would ensure if he couldn't own her, he would at least own the narrative of her destruction. The door closed, and the illusion ended. When Britt Ekland walked out, she left Peter Sellers alone with the one thing he feared more than death: his own reflection. For a man who had built his entire psychological architecture on the adoration of a beautiful woman. Her departure was not just a breakup, it was a collapse of the foundation. But Peter Sellers did not grieve like a normal man. He did not weep into his pillow or call a friend for solace. He went to war. The divorce of Peter Sellers and Britt Ekland was not a legal untangling of assets. It was a scorched earth campaign designed to annihilate Britt's character. Peter returned to London not as the rejected husband, but as the victim of a grand conspiracy. He utilized the British press, which treated him as a national treasure, to rewrite the narrative before Britt's plane had even landed. He planted stories. He gave interviews where he sat in his empty mansion, looking small and desolate, telling reporters that he had given her the world, the furs, the jewels, the stardom, and she had repaid him with cold Scandinavian indifference. He painted her as a gold digger who had extracted what she needed and discarded the host. The public devoured it. In the late 1960s, the cultural sympathy lay with the genius, not the beauty. Britt was branded as difficult, ungrateful, and ambitious, a dirty word for a woman in 1968. She had walked away with her freedom, but Peter ensured she left her reputation behind. She found herself blacklisted from certain social circles, whispered about in casting offices. Peter's reach was long, and his vindictiveness was infinite. He famously told his valet Bert, "She's nothing without me. I give her a year before she's back in Sweden herding reindeer." But the target of Peter's rage was not limited to his ex-wife. With Britt gone, his need for control had no outlet, so it turned toward the only other vulnerable subjects in his orbit, his children. If Peter Sellers was a terrible husband, he was a catastrophic father. To understand the depth of the tragedy, one must look at his relationship with his children from his first marriage, Michael and Sarah, and his daughter with Britt, Victoria. He viewed them not as human beings with needs, but as supporting actors in the movie of his life. And like any tyrannical director, if the supporting actors stole the scene or messed up a line, he punished them. The most chilling example of this occurred shortly after the divorce. It is a scene that belongs in a horror movie, yet it played out in a nursery. Peter was in a foul mood. The silence of the house without Britt gnawed at him. The children, Michael and Sarah, were playing. They were doing what children do, laughing, making noise, existing. To Peter, this noise was not the sound of life. It was an act of aggression. It interrupted his brooding. He stormed into the playroom. He didn't ask them to be quiet. He didn't scold them. His face was purple, his eyes bulging behind the thick frames of his glasses. He walked over to their toy box. He grabbed a toy, a prized possession, and smashed it against the floor. The children froze. The sound of shattering plastic echoed in the room. Peter didn't stop. He proceeded to methodically destroy their toys. He stomped on model cars. He tore the heads off dolls. He ripped pages out of books. He moved with the terrifying, silent efficiency of a man possessed. Michael and Sarah huddled in the corner, too terrified to cry, watching their father annihilate their small world. When he was finished, breathing heavily, surrounded by the debris of childhood joy, he looked at them. There was no remorse in his eyes. There was only the cold, dead stare of a man who felt justified. "I bought these," he said. "I can break them. If you cannot behave, you have nothing." He walked out, leaving them in the wreckage. This incident was not an anomaly caused by stress. It was the baseline of his parenting. Peter Sellers was the only child allowed in the house. He required all the attention, all the toys, and all the forgiveness. Any competing needs from his biological offspring were viewed as a threat to his ego. He formalized this rejection in a letter to his son Michael. that stands as one of the most brutal documents in the history of celebrity parenting. Following a minor disagreement, Michael had dared to offer a mild critique of one of Peter's films. Peter went to his typewriter. He didn't call, he didn't yell, he typed. The letter was formal, it was cold, it read like a legal eviction notice. In it, Peter Sellers resigned from the position of father. He told Michael that he felt no love for him, only irritation. He criticized Michael's appearance, his intelligence, and his personality. He wrote that Michael was a mediocrity, a disappointment who was leeching off the Sellers' name. He concluded by suggesting that Michael change his surname because he was unworthy of the brand. Imagine being a teenager and receiving a letter of resignation from your father. Imagine the psychological violence of being told, in writing, that your existence is a clerical error that is being corrected. Michael carried that letter and the weight of those words for the rest of his short life. Peter had effectively orphaned his children while he was still alive, punishing them for the crime of being separate people from him. While he was dismantling his children's psyches, Britt Ekland was fighting for her survival in the professional wilderness. Peter's prediction that she would be herding reindeer did not come true. Britt possessed a spine of steel that Peter had underestimated. She refused to disappear. She refused to be just the ex-Mrs. Sellers. But the shadow of the marriage hung over her career like a shroud. Every time she looked in the mirror, she heard Peter's voice. Rubbish, fat, ugly. She was a woman celebrated as a global sex symbol, yet she looked at her reflection and saw a monster. This body dysmorphia, installed by Peter's pinching, began to warp her decisions. She obsessed over her weight. She dieted frantically. She scrutinized her face for lines. And despite her beauty, she felt compelled to take roles that exploited her body because Peter had convinced her that her body was her only asset, and a flawed one at that. In 1973, she starred in The Wicker Man. It is now considered a classic of horror cinema, a masterpiece. Britt plays the landlord's daughter, a siren who tempts the protagonist. It was a role that required nudity. Peter heard about it, and he exploded. Even though they had been divorced for years, he still viewed her as his property. He viewed her nudity on screen as a personal insult to his dignity. He ranted to friends that she was degrading herself, that she was proving him right about her being cheap. He couldn't see the art. He could only see his ex-wife escaping his control. The fact that the film became a cult classic enraged him further. She was succeeding in a genre he didn't understand, without his help. Then came 1974, The Man with the Golden Gun. Britt Ekland was cast as Mary Goodnight, a Bond girl. In the cultural hierarchy of the 1970s, there was no higher pedestal for an actress's beauty. It was the ultimate validation. She was standing on the world stage in a bikini opposite Roger Moore. She was the fantasy of millions. But inside the bikini, Britt was terrified. She felt fraudulent. She felt heavy. The world saw a goddess. Britt saw the chunky girl Peter had mocked. She later admitted that she couldn't enjoy the height of her fame because she was waiting for someone to pinch her arm and tell her she was rubbish. Peter Sellers was thousands of miles away, but he was directing her internal monologue. While Britt was building a career out of the ashes, Peter was trying to fill the void with new acquisitions. He could not be alone. The silence in his head was too loud. He needed a mirror. He married Miranda Corey in 1970. She was a socialite, an aristocrat. It was a status acquisition. If Britt was the beauty, Miranda was the class. But Peter soon realized that an aristocratic wife had opinions. She had a voice. She didn't submit to the pinching. The marriage collapsed quickly. And then the darkness deepened. Peter's health began to fail. The pacemaker in his chest was keeping time, but the engine was rusting. He was approaching 50, and the fear of death, which had been a whisper since 1964, became a scream. He needed youth. He needed vitality to vampire. He found Lynn Frederick. Lynn was 20 years old. She was an actress. She was blonde. She looked startlingly like Britt Ekland. Peter was 51. The age gap was grotesque, even for Hollywood. He married her in 1977. Lynn Frederick is often painted as the villain of the Sellers saga, the wicked stepmother who seized the fortune. But in 1977, she was just another victim entering the slaughterhouse. Peter repeated the cycle. He bought her. He controlled her. But this time, he was too sick to be the physical tyrant he had been with Britt. He became an emotional wraith. He was resentful of Lynn's youth even as he coveted it. He was jealous of her health. The relationship was toxic and suffocating. Peter would spend days in his darkened room, hooked up to oxygen, watching his old movies, obsessing over his legacy, while Lynn was trapped in the mansion, serving as the nurse to a man who hated her for seeing him die. It was during this period, the late 70s, that Peter Sellers delivered his final and perhaps greatest performance. The film was Being There. The role was Chance the Gardener, a simple-minded man who knows nothing of the world except what he sees on television. He speaks in empty platitudes about gardening, and the world mistakes him for a profound philosopher. He becomes a national icon, an advisor to the president, purely because he is a blank slate upon which people project their own desires. Peter Sellers fought for this role for years. He was desperate to play Chance. Why? Because Peter Sellers was Chance. He recognized the character instantly. A man with no interior life, a man who mimics what he sees, a man who is empty. When Peter played Chance, he wasn't acting, he was revealing his true self. He stripped away the funny voices, he stripped away the accents, he played a void. The performance was chilling. It was a masterpiece of minimalism. Critics hailed it as the work of a genius. He believed this was his redemption. An Oscar wouldn't just be an award, it would be proof of his existence, proof that he was better than Britt, his children, and the world. The Academy Awards night came. Peter waited. The envelope was opened. He lost. Melvin Douglas won for Being There, Best Supporting Actor, but Peter lost Best Actor to Dustin Hoffman. The loss broke him. It wasn't just a disappointment, it was a metaphysical crisis. He had shown the world his naked emptiness, and the world had shrugged. He spiraled into a depression so black, it terrified even his sycophants. He told friends, "I have failed. I am a fraud. There is nothing there." The mask had cracked permanently. The energy required to maintain the Peter Sellers persona was gone. He became cruel in a new, desperate way. He lashed out at Lynn. He cut off his friends. He isolated himself in his room, surrounded by machines and memories. A King Lear of comedy raging at the storm. He began to reach out to the past. He called Britt. It was a strange, haunting phone call near the end. He didn't apologize. Peter Sellers was incapable of the vulnerability required for an apology. He rambled. He talked about the Dorchester Hotel. He talked about the flowers. He talked about the time before the pinch. Britt listened on the other end of the line. She was wary. She heard the weakness in his voice. She realized she wasn't talking to the monster anymore. She was talking to a ghost. He sounded small. He sounded like the boy from Southsea who just wanted his mother to tell him he was special. "I miss the times, Britt," he said. "We were good, weren't we?" "We were complicated, Peter." she replied. He couldn't accept the reality of the abuse, so he rewrote the history. He wanted Britt to validate his delusion that they had been a great love story, interrupted by circumstance, rather than a hostage situation interrupted by an escape. Britt hung up the phone with a sense of pity. She realized that he was dying, and he was dying exactly as he had lived, constructing a fantasy because the truth was too painful to bear. Peter interpreted her kindness as weakness. He interpreted her distance as a betrayal. As his heart began to stutter towards its final beat, his mind turned towards the ultimate act of control. He couldn't pinch her anymore. He couldn't smash her career anymore. But he had one weapon left, a weapon that would outlive him, a weapon that would hurt her and her daughter long after he was in the ground. He called his lawyers. He asked for the draft of his will. He sat in his study, the air thick with the smell of medicine and old paper. He looked at the names on the document: Michael, Sarah, Victoria, Britt. He picked up a pen. The hand that had signed autographs for millions, the hand that had smashed the toys in the nursery, now prepared to smash their futures. He didn't tremble. He felt a surge of power. This was his final scene. This was his final cut. He would edit them out of the fortune just as he had edited them out of his life. He slashed the numbers. He erased the bequests. He wrote in a new beneficiary, Lynn Frederick, the woman he was planning to divorce, the woman he despised. It didn't matter. Leaving it to her was the ultimate insult to Britt. It was a message. I would rather give my empire to a stranger I hate than to the woman who escaped me. He signed the paper. He sat back. He smiled. The trap was set. Now he just had to die to spring it. Death arrived with ironic timing. It didn't happen in a hospital. It happened at the Dorchester Hotel, the exact location where he had first trapped Britt with flowers 16 years earlier. Peter Sellers died on July 24, 1980. His funeral featured the jazz song In the Mood, a final joke. However, his will was cruel. Despite an estate worth millions, he left his children only 800 pounds each. He left Britt nothing. The entire estate went to Lynn Frederick. Lynn spiraled into addiction and died alone at 39. The trauma trickled down to Victoria Sellers, who spent the 90s battling drugs in the orbit of Heidi Fleiss. Britt Ekland, however, refused to be a casualty. She fought to save her daughter and eventually won. She battled her own demons, surviving disastrous plastic surgeries, driven by the ghost of Peter's criticism, before finally finding peace after the 2004 biopic exposed his true nature. Today, Britt is in her 80s, loud, unapologetic, and whole. Sitting in a makeup chair, asked if she wants to hide her wrinkles, she hears the faint echo of Peter's voice saying, "Rubbish." She brushes it away. "No," she says, "leave them. I earned them." In the end, the man of 1,000 faces died playing a role. Britt Ekland survived by accepting her own.